My family always ignored me, but wait until you see how I got my own life. For a long time, I believed my role in the world was to be someone's shadow. I grew up in a home where my brother's brilliance was almost a law, and silence was the space left for me. He was my parents' pride, their talent, their living joy. I was the proper, responsible daughter, the one who studied, helped, and didn't give them any trouble. While he received applause, I received advice about not showing off. I didn't understand what that meant. I only knew that somehow I needed to be smaller, and I molded myself to that. I hid in baggy clothes, avoided makeup, and kept my hair the same. Little by little, I became invisible, even to myself. And when you spend too much time invisible, you start to believe you don't deserve to be seen. My name is Isabella. I'm 27 years old. And for a long time, I lived with this feeling of being a blur in the background of other people's lives. I worked in a small clinic, studied at night, and rarely went out. My parents still treated me as if I were a fragile, opinionated girl. And I, without realizing it, fed this role. Living with my brother, Felipe, and his wife, Daniela, only reinforced this. They were always the center of attention at family gatherings. He, with his outgoing manner, and she, with her impeccable appearance and sharp remarks. I grew accustomed to being the target of veiled comparisons, and, in a way, I accepted it. But there came a time when this role began to suffocate. That's when I had to have eye surgery. Something simple, but it took me out of work for a few weeks. For the first time in a long time, I was alone with myself, without the demands of work, without the gaze of my family. Staring at the white ceiling of recovery was like staring into the emptiness of my life. I no longer knew who I was outside of the obligation to please. When I looked in the mirror after the surgery, I noticed something strange. My eyes were different, more alive, more awake. It seemed I could see the world, and myself, more clearly. It was during this period that something inside me began to change. I decided to cut my hair, a small change, but one that meant a lot. I remember my mother's look of astonishment when she saw me with my hair shorter and looser. She said, "Why change something that was good?" And I smiled, without responding, because, for the first time, I realized I didn't need her approval to exist. After that, I started taking better care of myself, not to please, but to recognize myself. I changed my baggy clothes, took a specialization course, and started going out on my own. The freedom at first was frightening, but gradually, the fear gave way to a feeling I had never experienced before: presence. The problem was that the more I found myself, the more it seemed to bother others. Daniela was the first to show it. She always had a subtle, almost rehearsed way of measuring me with her eyes. When she saw me for the first time after the change, she forced a smile and said, "Wow, you look so different." I understood her tone, and it was then that I realized that my transformation, which for me meant liberation, for her meant a threat. Little by little, the family atmosphere began to shift. Small comments began to appear, always shrouded in false caution. "Does this look suit you, Issa? Be careful not to seem forced." I pretended not to care, but inside I felt a storm brewing. Things got worse when preparations for my brother's wedding began. Daniela wanted everything to be perfect, and apparently, perfection meant I had to disappear a little more. She chose the bridesmaids' outfits, the colors, even the shade of nail polish. When she asked me to send a photo of the dress I would wear, I felt immediately uncomfortable. I sent a simple photo of a style I already owned, and she responded with a neutral emoji, followed by, "Maybe something more understated would look better on you, Issa. It's not your day, is it?" I read that message over and over. It wasn't just about a dress. It was a reminder of my supporting role, the very one I'd been trying to shed. I told my mother, expecting some kind of support, but she sighed and said, "Daughter, don't take it personally. Daniela just wants everything to turn out well. Don't complicate things." These words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Don't complicate things. It felt like a summary of my entire life. I was the one who shouldn't complicate things, shouldn't question things, shouldn't feel things. Meanwhile, Felipe kept saying it was better to let it go, that I was exaggerating. And perhaps I would have believed that if it weren't for Aunt Clara, she was the only one who looked at me sincerely and said, "Isabella, you don't need to diminish things to make anyone feel comfortable. That's not humility, it's erasure." From that moment on, something inside me clicked. I decided that at the wedding, I would be myself. No, Extravagance, no forcing, just me. I bought a dress that made me feel good, styled my hair the way I liked, and went. But as soon as I entered the salon, I noticed the stares. Daniela saw me, and for a second, her smile froze. Then she composed herself, but her discomfort was evident. Throughout the reception, I noticed the whispered conversations, the sidelong glances. When I went to greet her, she hugged me and whispered in my ear, "You could have been more simple, Issa. You're drawing." Unnecessary attention. I swallowed, pretending not to have heard. But inside me, something was beginning to break. The next day, my mother called me early. "Daughter, what happened to you yesterday? Danny was hurt. She thought you wanted to be seen more than she was." I was speechless. It was surreal to hear that. I tried to explain that I just wanted to feel good about myself, but she interrupted me. "Sometimes you need to know your place." That phrase echoed in my head for days. My place. I'd spent my life trying to fit into small spaces, and now I realized that was precisely what was stopping me from breathing. It was at that moment that I realized my fight wasn't against Daniela, nor against my parents. It was against everything I'd been taught to believe about myself. The family tension grew in a way I'd never seen before. Felipe began to distance himself, visibly torn between me and his wife. Daniela, on the other hand, subtly fueled the drama, always playing the victim, always. Hurt. My mother and father sided with her, telling me I needed to avoid conflict and be more understanding. I tried to remain calm, but I was exhausted. Sometimes I cried alone in my room, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. I didn't want to compete with anyone. I just wanted to exist without guilt. It was then that I realized that to achieve this, I would have to walk away. And perhaps that was the true act of courage I needed to perform. Deciding to distance myself from my own family was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There wasn't an explicit fight, nor a scandalous breakup. It was a silent, almost imperceptible withdrawal. I stopped attending Sunday meetings, stopped responding to the indirect messages, and began investing time in myself. At first, the guilt was unbearable. I felt selfish, ungrateful, almost like a traitor. But at the same time, there was a part of me that breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time, I had the right to exist without having to justify myself. Still, the loneliness was cruel. In the early days, the silence of the house felt like a reminder of everything I had lost, or thought I had. It was during this period that I began therapy. I needed to understand why it was so difficult to simply choose myself. The psychologist asked me a question that changed everything. Who is Isabella when no one is looking? I was left without an answer. I realized that my identity had been constructed based on others, on what my parents expected, what Felipe represented, what Daniela compared me to. I had never allowed myself to be just me, so I began to rediscover myself in small ways. Cooking while listening to music, going for a walk, reading books slowly. They were simple gestures, but charged with new meaning. I was, for the first time, choosing myself. Of course, it wasn't a linear process. There were days when everything felt like a mistake. Days when I'd pick up my phone to text my mom and delete it before sending it. Days when I'd dream about the past and wake up missing it. Not the coexistence itself, but the feeling of belonging, even if it was false. The pain of letting go is strange. It hurts, but it liberates. And I needed to accept that maturing also means losing certain illusions. One of them was that my family's love would always be fair. I discovered that sometimes you have to let go for love to become healthy again, or at least genuine. Over time, things began to reorganize. I returned to work with more energy, invested in courses, and met new people. It was during this process that I realized how much I had changed. People began to see me differently, not because of my appearance, but because of the way I carried myself. I spoke more confidently, looked people in the eye, and said no without justifying myself. And curiously, it was at this moment that my brother approached me. He said he missed talking to me and asked us to meet up. I accepted, but with a cautious heart. I knew the reunion would bring up old wounds. We met in a small cafe on a rainy afternoon. Felipe looked tired, unlike the usual confident man. He told me the marriage wasn't going well, that Daniela was more controlling and insecure than ever. "I think you were right about a lot of things, Issa," he said, his look a mix of regret and confusion. I listened silently. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about realizing that sometimes what destroys a relationship isn't hatred, it's imbalance. He confessed he felt trapped, that he didn't know how to cope. I felt compassion, not just for him, but for myself, for having carried for so long the burden of pleasing a world that never truly saw me. After that coffee, I spent days reflecting on my conversation with Felipe. For the first time, I realized that the favoritism that existed between us wasn't just his fault. It was a reflection of how we were raised. My parents projected onto him everything they admired and expected, while I was left with the role of balance, the daughter who couldn't make mistakes, who couldn't feel too much. He was shaped too, just differently. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it brought a kind of mature compassion, without naivete. I stopped seeing my brother as a rival and began to see him as someone who had also lost himself in the family's expectations. This brought me a new lightness. It was like letting go of a rope I'd been holding for years. A short time later, Daniela sent me a message. It was short, polite, and with a tone that mixed regret and defensiveness. If I made you feel bad, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to keep everything under control. I read it over and over again. I realized she wasn't truly apologizing. She was just trying to ease her own discomfort. Still, I responded sincerely. Don't worry, Daniela. Today I understand that control is a disguise for fear. She saw it but didn't respond. For once, this didn't shake me. I no longer needed her to acknowledge anything. The acknowledgement I needed was already within me. It was during this period that I began sharing a bit of my journey in online groups about self-esteem and personal reconstruction. I wrote about what I was experiencing, the doubts, the fears, the small victories. At first, it was just a way to vent, but over time, I realized that many people could relate. Some sent me messages saying they also felt excluded within their own families, that they were also trying to find themselves. I saw myself in them. And somehow, that mutual support became a mirror of healing. It was then that I realized, when we transform pain into sharing, the weight lessens. One day, my mother called me. Her voice was softer than I remembered. She said she missed me, that she wanted to see me. I was silent for a few seconds before responding. I wanted to see her again, but this time, in a different way, without the guilt, without having to justify myself. We made plans to have lunch. When I arrived, she looked at me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time. "You look different," she said, and I smiled calmly. "I'm myself, Mom. That's all." It was a simple but deeply symbolic moment. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to please, and curiously, she seemed to respect that. That conversation with my mother was the moment I realized that overcoming doesn't happen on a specific day. It's built, silently, within us. I didn't go back to being the submissive daughter, nor did I bitterly break ties. I simply stopped accepting the role of shadow. There's still a certain distance, it's true, but it's a healthy distance, full of clear boundaries. Today, I understand that distancing myself wasn't selfish. It was self-care. And if there's one thing I've learned in this process, it's that it's not about proving who we are to the world, but about remembering who we are, even when the world insists on erasing us. Over time, I realized my life was beginning to expand in ways I never imagined. The freedom of not having to please everyone opened up space for my own choices. Professional, social, even personal. I began to allow myself small pleasures, like traveling alone, experimenting with new styles, and visiting places that had previously intimidated me. Every step I took alone was a reminder that my worth didn't depend on the gaze of others. I finally felt like I owned my own story. One of the most memorable moments of this new phase was reconnecting with my old friends, whom I had neglected for fear of not being enough. They welcomed me without judgment, celebrating my achievements and supporting me in my vulnerabilities. For the first time, I felt a true support network, based on respect, affection, and authenticity. That sense of genuine belonging was liberating. I realized that relationships shouldn't be burdensome or manipulative. They should nurture, not demand. My relationship with Felipe has also changed. It's not perfect, and there are still occasional tensions, but we've managed to establish a relationship of mutual respect. He's learned to recognize my autonomy and, in a way, has also grown with my courage to speak out. The emotional distance that once separated us has become healthy. I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean submitting, and that familial love can exist without erasing individuality. Today, when I look back, I see an Isabella who survived neglect and comparison, who faced manipulation and insecurities, but who didn't let herself be defined by others. Every challenge, every malicious comment, every attempt at erasure was a push for me to better understand myself and become stronger. I learned that overcoming is not the absence of pain, but the ability to move forward, even bearing scars. That true victory is to exist authentically, without fear of being seen. I'm sharing my story now because I want others to feel that it's possible to bounce back, even in situations where it seems like everything is conspiring against you. It's possible to reconnect with yourself, set boundaries, truly love yourself, and above all, realize that your voice matters. I still deal with parts of the pain, but I've learned that I can live without diminishing myself. Today, I walk with confidence, knowing that my light doesn't have to dim anyone else's, and that finally, I can shine in my own way.